Howdy, folks. This is about the sixth episode of this platform thinking, platform design podcast. I've been talking to a lot of great people about how to think about platforms, how to design platforms, what criteria we should think of, patterns, things like this. It's been great so far. I'm really excited today to have my friend Simone Cicero here with me. I apologize if I brutalized your name. I'm terrible.
Everybody does it, don't worry.
Um, and I've known Simon's work for just for a long time. When I first started doing a lot of research for my PhD into platforms, from a slightly different angle, but trying to be interested in things like commenting and how platforms could be considered as part of that kind of idea. Simon's work came up, of course, almost immediately, and it was great to be able to read and learn from him. So I'm hoping everybody out there gets to learn from him today. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you. I am the CEO at Boundaryless. Boundaryless is a company with a mission of democratizing access to the future of organizing. And we do it by creating open source, Creative Commons tools. The most famous, let's say, is the Platform Design Toolkit, which was the first and probably the most commonly adopted design framework, specifically, let's say, designed for platform thinking, so marketplaces, developer ecosystems and things like that. And recently also we also developed what we call the 3EO toolkit that essentially dives into the organizational developments that can resonate and enable companies and organizations more in general to develop, their strategies in a hyper connected environment like the one we live.
Cool. So your work tends to address platforms more broadly than some of the other people I've talked to, where there's a lot of conversation right now in IT, right, around or in software development world around
Right.
Platforms and kind of developer experience, enablement, concerns about operations and stuff like that. So just so we get a good kind of ground to start with, like how would you define platforms for this conversation? How you like us to kind of think about platforms as we get started?
That's a very, very complex answer to give, but in terms of products, I try to offer a easy framework, like three value propositions that normally coexist in a platform strategy. It's one is a product, so essentially a bundle of functionalities, let's say, or a bundle of services that are provided by the company, by the organization, to the customer, to a key customer. You can think of, for example, Shopify e-commerce solutions. Like to build your e-commerce shop, you can use Shopify SaaS. Then there is sometimes on top of the product what I call a marketplace. So you can think of your customer being connected to its own customers, for example, with a demand generation marketplace, like the one that you can find in Airbnb, for example. Let's say your customer is a host and she is connected with guests. In Shopify, they don't have a demand generation marketplace. Shopify is famous for not aggregating demand, actually, but they aggregate services. So, for example, you can buy from experts. You can buy marketing services, branding, and things like that. And finally, another piece of the triangle, let's say, of the triad, it's what I call extension platforms. So essentially, again, look back into the original product we spoke about in Shopify is the e-commerce solution. You can think of how Shopify extends the product through templates, and apps. So typically extensions are either libraries, apps, templates. Many times they are developer generated, like independent service provider, independent software vendors that connect their products into your product. Or it can be user generated content like templates or libraries. So you can think of Figma libraries, for example, and things like that. So these are the three elements from a perspective of how can I describe, how should I describe platforms from a product perspective, from a technology perspective, value proposition perspective. If you think more generally, you can probably, I would like to mention maybe two things. A platform for me has always been a mix of what I call a learning engine. So a space where players can become better at what they do, express their potential, and the platform normally provides support to this process of improvement with acupunctural services like onboarding and getting better and transformative elements and so on. So for example, in Airbnb, I enter as a guest and then I can become a host and then I can become a super host, for example, a co-host, hosting for others and so on. And finally, what I call the transactions engine. So essentially is how you reduce the transaction cost for entities in the ecosystem to interact. And these two things normally convey a more general approach. So the question is, how can I design something as a platform? And my answer would be, think about the learning engine and a transaction engine.
Cool. Yeah. Yes, a lot of my work as a designer in my PhD program is in what we call transition design. So this idea that a platform kind of needs to meet the user where they are and then kind of guide them through a series of steps or a journey to becoming more competent, I think is a really interesting way of thinking about it. I was talking to another guest earlier, Spencer Pittman, who is involved in a platform from a game design studio. And one of the things we were talking about is the idea that like a platform is similar to like learning a new video game. Like there's a whole intro part to any video game. They teach you how the basic mechanics, how the physics work, etc., in order to get you up to speed. So I think that's an interesting kind of view. And translating for, in my mind, at least for the IT perspective, kind of the transactional concerns end up being things like kind of lowering cycle times around deployment, making it easier to access certain services and self-service access, and these types of things. And as you see a lot of people in the IT world kind of referencing, flow and theories from Don Reinertsen about, how to think through theory constraints and things like this to kind of get access to the platform, being a critical aspect of that. Can we? I know you've been talking about this recently, and I was thinking about it a little bit. Can we talk about like bundled and unbundled? Because you mentioned that as well. So how do you think about bundling and unbundling from a platform perspective? I have an idea, but let's hear your version first.
Well, in general, I think that there is one expression of bundling and unbundling that has been connected with platforms so far, mainly as the age of success of platforms. So the last decade, basically 15 years, has been a lot of there's been a lot of unbundling the lower parts of the value chain, like inventory, for example. And think about Airbnb, that has been popularized as the biggest hotel in the world that doesn't own any room. So unbundling the liabilities, the inventory, because inventory is a major liability, right? Because you have to maintain it, you have to improve it, and so on. And rebundling nearer to the customer. So essentially, these platforms have unbundled the liabilities and rebundled around the customer, mainly monopolizing demand, filtering, matchmaking, and things like that, right? And that's been the playbook, let's say, of the platform. And this has been also popularized by Ben Thompson, right? He wrote his aggregation theory explaining that the major transition in the platform economy has been a transition from economies of supply side economies, so dominating market by controlling suppliers, which is the industrial playbook, into dominating markets by controlling demand, which is the platform playbook. So one of the expression could be this, and I can also add that after the first 15 years, we have in the last 5, we have seen a lot of rebundling also going down in the value chain, and many of the platforms that exist now in the market, they have been looking into vertical markets, more vertical ones, to serve a more specific, to differentiate, let's say, you think about, you face a market where there are these giants. So how do you differentiate? And you can differentiate in 2 ways. One is going vertical, so resegmenting the market for a vertical space and creating more specific user experiences. And another way is to give a step function in the experience. That means you have to bundle back the lower part of the value chain. So a good example is, Open Door, marketplace for houses, where they actually develop a service where they buy the houses from the seller. They sometimes renovate it and push it back into the market, which is an extremely capital intensive element and extremely lots of liabilities. Indeed, some competitors have had some hard times doing so. So that's an example of the rebundling that I'm talking about. And of course, unbundling has also been be used to describe this process of verticalization. So somebody has been talking about the unbundling of Craigslist, right? Say, once we had Craigslist, and then we had all these verticals and more vertical and so on. And recently, Dan Hockenmeyer from FAIR, he wrote this piece called The Unbundling Fallacy, where basically explains very well that we may be at a stage in the market when this unbundling, let's say, playbook of going vertical doesn't work anymore, because the economics you can generate from unbundling, so more specifically your payback period, it's going to be not enough for you to stay sustainable on the market. So, for example, if you go into a vertical, sometimes you may have less frequency of transactions, for example, and at the end of the day, the numbers don't stand. So essentially, what feels like we are living up, kind of reaching a plateau of platform economies, where most of the things that were easy to organize this way have been already organized, and now the verticals are much more complex. So that's first part of the unbundling, rebundling conversation. And of course, there is another word of unbundling and rebundling that deals with organizations. So, for example, the trio practice that I help companies adopt, it's an unbundling practice. So essentially, it's about getting into an organization that is normally siloed or bundled, and unbundling it into divisions or product units, or how we call it, micro enterprises, so that you can generate better adaptability and resilience. And to give it back to you, I think you spoke about IT. One thing that I believe it's been underestimated a bit in the discussion around IT and platforms and DevOps and so on, it's been that essentially there is the product and the organization mirror each other. Okay. So it feels like sometimes that for example, the team topology stuff or that kind of stuff, they are a bit like one size fits all, while in reality, from what I've seen, these product organizations, these platforms, have normally organized internally in a way that mirrors the product they bring to the market. So making the traditional approaches to DevOps or platform engineering a bit too narrow for to respond to these transitions.
Yeah, I think that's right. So the thing that I was thinking about when you're talking, and the thing that I've been thinking about around this bundling, unbundling thing. I mean, I think it would be great to talk a little bit more about kind of the Conway's law mirroring theory version of like unbundling, where you're talking about both organization and technology. And I think that's really interesting. In my work, we kind of refer to that kind of like the importance of socio-technical joint optimization, right? The social system and the technical system have to be like moderated against each other. They can't be done independently. But the bundling and unbundling, so I have this like 3-tier way of thinking about how at least a software engineering group might think of a platform. So the first one is just an opinionated configuration of components, right? So this is your bundled thing, right? Like I put all the things together in a way that I think they're pre-integrated in a way that I think creates value for you if you use my service. But generally, like we prefer that you not like play underneath the covers. You can build something on top of this, but like don't play underneath the covers, right? And the second one is and this has to do with granularity to me, right? Like the bundled thing is a high grain, large grain service offering, and then you could also do like unbundled, fine grain, but deployed in a way that it's relatively easy to configure things together. So like you can kind of like figure out how to configure them yourself or integrate them differently as a set of services. And then the final one that I think that's the big argument right now. What granularity in a lot of organizations? Like, do we do a big grain Heroku style platform, or do we do a small grain AWS? Like, I have access to a bunch of services, but I have to figure out how to put them together view. And I have this suspicion that like the thing that people are actually going to end up on eventually is a decomposable system. So, if you've got a composable platform, which is fine grain, a decomposable one will be an opinionated one that you can take apart and put new things into. So it starts opinionated, but it doesn't try to force you to use the opinionated patterns. It just is like there's a low effort way for the organization to adopt things. And if there's specific cases in which, some other technology is going to work, you can unbundle or decompose the platform and kind of reintegrate it together. And I think that's partially because what I see, one of the things that I say to people when I talk about platforms all the time is everybody wants a Heroku experience, which is like I type something and the platform's installed and I just start coding. No, but nobody wants Heroku in specific. They want their own Heroku, basically. So we get this thing where it's like we have to figure out, to me, how each IT organization can create the golden path, can create the architecture and the bundling in a way that works with their organization, but then offers this like low resistance kind of way of getting adoption to work. And I know like we've talked a little about this before, kind of as another sideways point. You were talking a little bit about how products at an industrial economics, and I love, I like economics, and I love that you're bringing economics to the table as well. I usually think that one of the biggest problems that platform teams have is they take central IT management. So, and what I mean by that is like central IT is primarily responsible for management of consumable resources, right? So that basically means if people use too much of the network, everybody pays for it. If people use too much of the CPU, everybody pays for it, right? So because it's consumable, it actually does require exactly what you were describing, a way of throttling people, of preventing them from using too much, or at least managing use, right? So like you can't use so much that I can't provide it to you, right? So there's more of a set of constraints that need to be in place there. Whereas in a platform play, kind of like your payback period that you were talking about requires that for the economics to work, that there's rapid and continuous adoption of everything that's deployed in order to achieve the payback that you've invested forward in, right? So if you apply those central IT department rules, like slow people down, don't let them have access to too much stuff, to a thing that requires rapid adoption, you break the economics of the platform pretty quickly, in my mind. And that's not to say that some of the resources in the firm, like again, these consumable resources, need the right economic frame, and that does include kind of a central control of consumption paradigm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, in general, what I felt in this conversation we're having is there's a bit of a bifurcation, let's say, right? What do I mean with this? So platforms, the ones that we know from the market, when we talk about platforms like Airbnb, Uber, and so on, we talk about something that has a very tight execution space, right? The workflows you can execute are very simple. Airbnb is basically 9 steps, and because they want to achieve this massive scale, they need to have this idea of core transactions and scalability and so on. So let's say that the IT element, it's really how can I say in English, but it's much less important than we believe it is. It's much more about the UX, the workflow, the design, the ontology, much less about how we actually make this happen. Okay. That's my impression. I mean, I'm not an IT person, but my impression is when I speak with these kind of leaders, design and growth, normally have a much product ownership, product management have much bigger role than engineering in these kind of organizations. And then instead, we are making a fuss about stream-aligned teams and features and platform teams and so on, while this is somehow these are patterns that start to become important once we start to degrade. Is it English? Degrade the product experience. There is this way of saying customers flock to simple products. Products become complex. Customers move to simple products. Okay, so I think the direction we are going is organizations where small teams can produce large impacts, right? Ultra scalable products. At the moment, this is happening through this strong product leadership. Okay. So, for example, when you start to have so many people, so many teams starting to add features into a product, they break things. And for example, last week, I was listening to this interview. Jason Calacanis had been interviewing Airbnb Brian Chesky, and Chesky explained how basically he controls everything that goes online. And Airbnb has 2 release windows. They concentrate all the release in 2 moments in the year. They communicate it very strongly. They are very editorial as an organization, right? So what does it mean? That you don't need all these tribes and squads and whatever. Basically everything is centralized, pyramidal, because it's one product. Okay, it's one product. So my impression is, if organizations want to be big in the future, want to have this possibility to become big organizations, they need to be modular and unit-based and micro-enterprise-based and entrepreneurial. Because otherwise, you're just building another form of bureaucracy, which we like more, because we talk about stream-aligned teams and platform teams and so on, but it's still a bureaucratic organization where things really need process and alignments and things start to crack very easily. So on top of this, if we think about what's happening with AI, it's really hard to ponder what are going to be the impacts in the way we organize engineering, because think about conversational programming,
Yep.
no code, AI based composability, and so on. What do you have? You end up with a market where you either build one small component, okay, or you build a curated experience.
Yep.
Okay. For example, again, coming back to Airbnb, Chesky said we didn't go live with a ChatGPT plugin for Airbnb because we couldn't control the user experience.
Yep.
Okay. So I think my impression is the future of markets, especially when it comes to software-based products, digital products, let's say, it's going to be either very curated vertical experiences to which you have to develop this strong brand attachment and editorial leadership. So basically, you don't need this modular IT, whatever, because there is one decision maker, one product owner, the CEO distributes the editorial leadership across a couple of, maybe a few more product owners that go and make things happen, maybe on twice a year. And on the other side, you have protocols, APIs, and things that will benefit from AI-mediated integrations and no code or whatever, basically bringing each customer building its own experience by picking all this stuff. And the result is small teams. Either way, small teams. Much smaller than the ones that we have at the moment in terms of engineering.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I think when I was listening to you, one of the things I was thinking about a little bit was there's two things. I keep on being reminded when you talk about certain things, including like feature race, adding more and more features and breaking the product from kind of like complexity, introducing too much complexity or too much optionality into the product, making it confusing for the customer. But also some of the bundling and unbundling. It reminds me a lot of Clayton Christensen's disruption theory, right? Where the idea is that, there's a market need, and then most companies start below market need. And as they hit market need, they often spawn a competitor that then they kind of get into a tit for tat war that develops the product above market need. Basically, it does stuff that the market doesn't necessarily need anymore. And then you get this kind of like life cycle moment where someone says, I can unbundle this down to a core set of features and offer it for 10 times less than the current market. And that tends to eat the inside of these larger kind of plays up. So I think there's that kind of way of like talking about the tension or the kind of environmental pressures of bundling and unbundling and like the way that markets drive those things. But I also am interested in this idea of like, if I say FinOps, do you have a general idea what that might mean? Like the idea that like each component should be able to express its costs, basically like component-based P&Ls, right? Like that a team should understand how much it's costing to run that thing. And I always kind of think about the relationship between unbundling here is that in a lot of organizations have these big monoliths, right? Which is, the pyramid structure you're talking about, but like a big structure, macro structure. And the way those tend to get funded, in my opinion, is everybody knows the big ERP system is going to get funded next year. So everybody pork barrels that budget with more and more nonsense because they know that it'll stream them in. Whereas FinOps, I think, at some point it starts decomposing it from a financial perspective and causing more and more pressure on individual components where people, smart teams would look at it and say, we should do nothing other than what our API promises. We shouldn't do anything else. We should get rid of everything else that's inside of our component and make sure that it's other people's components that are doing those things, because that's the way for us to manage our P&L better. And to me, this ends up causing eventually a lot of pressure to create that platform, that like shared common resource, because there should be a bunch of teams that are trying to get stuff out of their components, and one place to put those things would be in a centralized platform, so that they don't have to deal with it anymore. So I mean, does that make sense? Like, what other economic kind of observations should people be thinking through with their platform implementations, either internal or external?
Yeah, I mean, in general, this trend, again, I see the bifurcation here, right? So the commons, the commodities go into the platform. The platforms start maybe inside one company, but at the end of the day will be, cross company. At some point, there will be commons, because we can think of, for example, protocols, how the blockchain is enabling, I would say, this idea of hyperstructures, so infrastructures that are self-managed, not auto-managed, let's say. And they are basically permissionless, and they have their own sustainability models and so on. So lots of this platform work will end up being integrated in composable protocols, composable platforms, composable commons. And you're right. There would be a certain amount of components with their own P&L. These components will necessitate, since they don't have to innovate the user experience much, they basically they will be on their own quite automated. They won't need much actual work, human work anymore. Okay. So you can think of them as libraries. Okay. So imagine big platforms, infrastructures that are stateful and execute the computation and so on. Libraries on the other side. Okay. And then somebody will take some of these and add on top the user experience and make these curated experiences. In a way, these curated experiences, I think, like the Airbnbs of the future, these things that people will pay more because they have an editorial characteristic, like a brand attachment or something like that, will be the last resort of capitalism, because all the rest will be starting to be affected by this idea of the general intellect, which is basically a self-producing digital economy that doesn't cost almost anything and doesn't imply any human contribution, and from which you cannot extract any profit. So we are starting to see this with AI. For example, when Google said, we don't have any advantage, we don't have any moat, because you cannot extract profit from AI. Okay. It's not humans. It's not people. You cannot extract. Profits can be extracted only from people. So this is, again, a bifurcation. Vertically integrated brands, self-executable, composable, AI-mediated components. But the question, I think, an interesting question is, and we are seeing this kind of first signals, right? Once the capitalism stops working, the big question is, what do we do with the general intellect, as communities? What kind of things are we going to build with these modules, with these technologies? And the answer for me is really, I would say, it's in cooperative models, much more place-based economies, much more care-based economies, which we don't know yet how do they work. But I think we are in a moment where we are transitioning from getting excited about how we do things into an age where we have to get excited about what we actually do. And not just how we do it, because we spent the last 20 years, me and you and others, getting excited about platforms and modules and IT, but in the meantime, our fundamentals in the economy have been degrading, and our environments and places and communities. So now it's probably a reckoning moment for us.
I agree. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of the reasons I love to think about platforms and and co-creation, and this idea of being able to compose and decompose, it is because I think that there is a set of, like, again, common need, right? Like things that just have to be generally true for people to be able to function. Roads, for instance. And then there's, like, the local farmers market, where people have assembled together and created a marketplace that can only exist because of the infrastructure that's available, but is local. It's local. It's locally based. It's about local food. It's about yeah. So this, like, this weird, in transition design, we refer to it as this cosmopolitan localism. There's like this weird tic tac between global structures and local structures. And it seems clear that for at least the last 10, 15 years, the market has overemphasized global universal structures as opposed to the pressures of kind of local systems. And I think that has significantly impaired a lot of people's perception of their own agency in the world and things like that. So I think these conversations aren't just for me about, like, interesting ways of doing IT, but they're about kind of like thinking through some of those future social structures and what we'll have to be able to do better, I think. So I had this other, like, I had this other question that was brewing around in my head. So I'll do it this way really quickly. A lot of organizations, big multinationals, grow by merger and acquisition, right? They can't grow organically anymore, so they have to go out and kind of consume other smaller things. And when I worked with several of these multinationals, one of the conversations that always comes up, which is a little bit of this global versus local, is do you want to be a holding company, in which case your portfolio is valued by how much each individual product, as an individual product, maybe a little bit of brand overlay, but generally the profit will just be the profit of each individual product that you have? Or do you want to leverage your mergers and acquisitions to create some sort of user journey or cross-cutting concern across your products, right? So I usually say things like, if you were a biomedical company that owned everything from, like, pharmaceuticals to physical objects and things like this, you would probably be able to predict, for instance, the user journey for a hip replacement. And you could have a pre-curated experience that cuts across a series of different products, so that as the user is going through this very predictable series of events, they would have a place where they would have to, like, re-log in 20 times to 20 different products and re-identify themselves. And maybe there's even, like, a visual system that helps you know that you're still on the journey with them, things like that. And so the weird thing to me about saying that is I think that all that stuff is a platform too, right? That's what a platform kind of looks like, this ability to kind of, like, move from a holding company to a composed set of experiences based on a cross-cutting concern. But it brings up a couple of issues for me. One, I don't think it's what most people think of a platform, because most people think of a platform, at least in IT, as being kind of down there below the software engineers supporting, as opposed to this system that runs on top, like a design system. So I guess my first question is generally, like, can we consider design systems like this a platform? In your terminology, kind of the editorial UX. And then the second part of the question would be, doesn't this tend to point out that, like, we often are trying to, like, our value streams, as you pointed out, tend to be, like, they could easily be drawn up and down, because they tend to, like, the stream is conceptualized as going from development into infrastructure, right? Like, that's how people think of it, because somehow, like, production environments are down here, and so they think of the stream as cutting across. They think of it going from development to operations, whereas I think the stream that I'm pointing at is across product teams and requires a new way of organizing the firm, so that those product teams have a way of communicating with each other, handing data to each other, predicting which data is going to be captured in which place and shifted to other places. It seems to me like a very different way of organizing the production of the system. Any thoughts about that?
Well, yes, I think, starting from the latter, when you said, we used to think about this vertical integration, because in general, I think in the past, we gave much more importance to operations, and this is somehow disappearing because of we are looking into a future of somehow self-executable infrastructures, where the infrastructure is programmable. You can think of it as an expression of, as I said, Web3 protocols, but also Industry 4.0 platforms. Like, for example, one of our partners, Hire, has this platform called Cosmoplat, that essentially allows you to connect deeply inside the industrial capacity to generate these extremely configurable capabilities and personalized outcomes. Like, you can program a broad industrial capacity very easily, right? So that's why you can think of operational infrastructures a bit like, they're there, you can use it, it's easy, you just can plug into them, you don't need to think too much about them. Of course, cloud has been an early expression of this. What else? Yes, I mean, I think in general, we are looking into what we call ecosystem brands that are more about investing and sustaining, basically exerting their systemic expression through investments, not through management, but through enabling constraints and investments. Okay. And what kind of enabling constraints are we talking about? We're talking about contracts. We're talking about services. So, the organization, imagine you merge and acquire lots of stuff. Then you have to unbundle those things into their product capabilities. Probably you have to abstract the common platforms a little bit and give them as a service. Finance, legal, whatever, IT, and so on. And then you have to just tell them, this is the forcing function, this is the enabling constraint, this is the contracts you can use, and you have to have positive P&L, for example, or you have to respond to these KPIs, okay? And then the system self-organize. So, for example, in the Trio and in Rendan Hay from Hire, which is the management practice that originally inspired that, there are these constructs of VAM contracts, which are contracts that the company uses to seed the new nodes, new product nodes. And then there are these EMC contracts, that stands for Ecosystem Micro Community, that essentially are contracts that nodes can use to agree on a new scenario they want to bring to the market. So let's say that product, the idea of product is expressed at two layers. One layer is modular product, and one layer is scenario products, right? Conjunctions of products. So you have to have these composing as a function, as a continuous function, bundling as a continuous function in the organization. You have to have this kind of leadership in the organization. So nodes have to have the capability to express user scenarios, and for this they have to be in touch with customers, essentially, and have these basic capabilities of putting everybody around the table and distribute skin in the game and let them bring this into the market. Suddenly, by the way, as a result of this, your organization becomes like goo. Zhang Grumin, the CEO of Hyatt, said, we want to be like water at some point. Okay, and secondly, the border of your organization is no more there. Just doesn't mean anything anymore. You can cooperate with but you have a contract, so you can cooperate with anybody. And indeed, that's what happens with some of these companies. And it's similar to what Amazon did with the software-centric architecture that they had. And suddenly, once you take the marketplace at Amazon and you say, this is going to be unbundled from the categories, Suddenly you can create an open marketplace because you can leave the ecosystem to provide the categories that you don't have internally. So this idea of nodes and interfaces and transient aggregations really puts a big question mark on the area of organization we are used to think about, mainly by basically destroying middle management, and mainly by transforming leadership into either editorial leadership or investment leadership. So if you think about Apple on one side, full expression of editorial leadership, and companies like Microsoft or Amazon, which are much more about investing leadership, venture leadership. You can see that expressed already in some of the most important companies on the market.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, so I think it'd be interesting to talk about. I've asked this question to a bunch of people, and I'd be interested to hear your view of it, because you've already talked about it a little bit, I think. So in my mind, one of the things that I try to argue with people about a little bit is that applying product management to a platform is certainly a step forward from like where it currently is. Like most places don't have a real structured way of thinking about their platform at all, and certainly maybe talking to the people who are consuming the platform seems like it might be a good idea. But I still have this question that has to do with what qualities differentiate a product from a platform? Are there any? And two, what skills then would we need to develop to be better at something like that we might call like platform management instead of product management? And so like my instinct is things like, again, I think it's harder in the way that you're talking about, because you basically eventually are decomposing things into components that are directly interacting, as opposed to any sort of necessarily hierarchical structure. But I usually think of things like co-creation, being able to work across the ecosystemic structures, like so composing things that are in the ecosystem together, helping them compose each other. Those are skills that are different, right, than the current way of looking at it. So really quickly, to kind of try to clarify what I'm thinking about there, is I usually try to say that there's like a stack of the way that strategy works in a firm. There's tactics, like how you do a thing. There are operational concerns, which is like how, or strategies is what I usually talk about. That's more your like when you talk about differentiating in a marketplace. To me, a strategy is about how to apply the infrastructure or platform or components we have to a particular niche. That to me is strategy. And then there's systemics, which is like, what capabilities should the firm have in order to maximize the number of strategies we can deploy in order to maximize the number of niches we can fit into, right? But all that ends up being like in-house strategy, like stuff about what's happening internal to the team or to the structure. Ecosystemic strategy to me is something almost nobody really thinks well about right now in most of the places that I talk about, because it's like literally the strategy of, how do I get peer systems where there isn't a central controller and there isn't someone who can say you must work together. There's only that there's these components and I want them to work together. It's a whole set of skills, management and practices that I think we still have to develop in a lot of firms. Does that feel right? Or
yeah. I mean, I think in general, my impression is that productization is something that it's an expression of this idea of modularization and embedded P&L. So making yourself really useful for someone else, having a value proposition, okay, providing something of service, okay. So whenever a company, especially in the context of the market we live today, which has very low transaction costs, right? Whenever you bundle something, it needs to make sense. Okay. And creating a platform somehow it's a bundling element, right? And so the question is, why are you bundling a platform? Okay, you're doing that maybe because you want to provide a better response time versus what you can source on the market. So you are happy to sustain a little bit of I would say organizational depth because you want to be faster. Okay, you trust your teams to be faster. Okay.
Yep.
Another thing you can bundle things in a platform for is brand coherence.
Yep.
You don't want to be incoherent on the market, so you say, for example, some of our customers are doing bundled go-to-market services, which is very dangerous. You're basically saying, I want to be coherent as a brand, but the danger is that you're going to slow down your teams quite a lot and accumulate organizational debt. So my mental model is be careful of what you bundle, because bundling is debt at today. Okay.
Yep.
Of course, there are other things that can generate an advantage in bundling, which is, for example, network effects.
Yep.
So if you cannot create common domain models, ontologies that are still open, then you can create common ontologies by creating a platform, okay? And essentially, you basically accepting to have certain technical and organizational depth because you want to enforce an ontology. Okay.
Yeah.
Again, it's a way to accumulate network effects and to make things faster. So if you want to differentiate your organization from the market, maybe you can do some of these things, but always with very conservative way. And another thing is, my impression is the markets are moving from being very vertical into being very chaotic. Like you can have a platform being an extension of another product and a product connecting into the platform. So it's going to be a network of things and a texture that is very hard to explain in the traditional way, infrastructure, platform, products, and so on. So if you ask me about the wise thing to do today, I would really look into carefully into bundling things into platforms, especially if you can't generate a strong advantage by doing so. If it's just because this is how we do things, that's a big red alert. Technical debt, organizational debt, potential bureaucracy alert, scapegoating, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So I think when you were talking, it made me think of there's a complexity theorist named Paul Cillier, and he wrote this essay once that was called "A Certain Kind of Slowness," and the point of the essay was basically this: if you are in an environment, an actor in an environment, and you become 100% reactive to the environment, you basically have failed to differentiate from the environment. People basically won't be able to see you there. You won't have an identity, because identities, being a thing, is about making commitments that make you move a little bit slower than the chaos in the environment around you. Like you don't react to everything, basically. You have a position, and that's makes kind of a stable is not the right word, but a reproducible or a dissipative system occur within the environment, right? Is that you can identify Simone because he's not just a bag of atoms that can rematerialize in lots of different ways. He just generally consistently looks like this for at least a reasonable period of time, right? So that there's a second kind of thing I usually think about with that, which is this quote by Grady Booch, and Grady wrote this quote that basically says, architecture is about the decisions that are hard to undo. Like basically they're about commitments. And so when you're talking about bundling and unbundling, I want to point out that that's a design decision. It's not an absolute on either direction. It's not like it's absolutely true to unbundle everything and be completely reactive to the market. It's also equally untrue that it's useful to be a monolith and unreactive to the environment. It's about achieving some sort of balance in between those two things. Yeah,
totally. I mean, the resonance that I get from this is since the trajectory of the digital world is to unbundle everything into components, it would be how do you differentiate?
Yep.
Either by being so smart to create something so nice that people have a brand attachment to, like Airbnb, for example,
Yep.
or by creating value for a contextual set of players. So basically self-production. Okay, so I create value for myself. We create value for ourselves. So we are the ones that can judge if this is something we want, we like, we want to sustain and create. So again, I mean, self-production, I think it's a way to regain meaning in a market that is going towards very difficult possibilities for differentiation, right? So what makes things different? Either because they have a narrative that is so strong that I can feel attached to, or they're just different because I am the only one that can appreciate that. For example, I create solar farm that makes energy for my neighborhood. Okay, that's very high value because it's out of the market. There's not someone else judging and mediating the relation between the production I'm putting together and the feeling of value for myself, which is to some extent something that we can see also in a no-code, low-code, self-code, self-assembly, user innovation toolkits. So if I make things for me, I set the value, and that's a way to differentiate.
Yeah, interesting. So I had one more question. When we kind of think about this, one of the things that I see in a lot of firms, right? Like, so the classic agile thing, right? To me, so the reason I'm pointing that out is like, in a way, agile is a unbundling effort, right? It's like the teams are too big, the production times are too long. What we need to do is like collapse the production time, have a lot more iterations with a lot smaller teams. It doesn't really conceptualize how that should work in an ecosystem or even in an organization. It just basically says, leave us alone in a smaller team and we will produce more value for the organization. It doesn't explain really almost anything other than that as far as this kind of unbundling effort. But there's this result of that frequently that you get where you get to the end of the agile transformation and the executive or the middle management goes, okay, great. Now we have a bunch of very independent teams, but they won't do what we want them to. You're like, right? No, that's exactly what you were trying to achieve. Because in a way, if they will only do what you want them to, then they will only do the best that you can think of them doing. Like you don't know everything; they know things, and so there's a value exchange creation happening here. So I just wonder, when we are moving towards these kind of like, again, these more granular structures, smaller grain structures, a lot more interaction, complexity as in like interactions between the components. How should like an I could get that as a bunch of startups. I can get that as a bunch of small personally owned businesses. How should enterprises like think about managing literally introducing complexity into their organization or unhiding it? Like one of the things I usually say is like hierarchies just are hiding the complexity. Basically, this unbundling effort is just a way of exposing the inherent complexity in the system more. But how do I manage? Like, what should I think of as an executive or a manager when I start seeing these people, these parts of the system kind of doing things that no one asked them to do?
Yeah, because they have to be accountable, otherwise it's going to be a tragedy. And the problem in Agile has been all too often that there's no accountability to the customer. So when I look into an unbundled organization, I see that as a swarm of black boxes. So I don't want to tell anybody what to do inside the black box. I just dictate one forcing function that makes the accountability. So you are accountable to the forcing function.
Mm.
Is it positive P&L? Good. Is it KPIs? Good. Then it's up to you. Do you want to be agile? Fine. Do you want to be autocratic? Fine. That's you. It's your culture, but your culture is inside the black box.
Yeah.
Okay. You cannot export your culture inside to the whole organization. If you have an agile transformation and everybody stops doing what they are told to do, that's a problem, because they are not accountable to the customer unless you are not you have not unbundled the organization into micro-entrepreneurial units. So doing self-management without accountability. I even had once, I talked to a company where people were doing self-set salaries without accountability. That's crazy. That's completely crazy. You basically destroy the organization, right? So I think in general, this debate around accountability resonates with acknowledging complexity for real. Okay. So if we acknowledge that there is no positive sum game, okay, there is no win-win. We have been talking too much about win-win, positive sum, and zero externalities. That's not the case. If you have a complex system which is bounded, you always have negative externalities. So the question is, if you push accountability at the border of black boxes, then the black boxes can die. It's fine. They can die. They can be substituted. But as long as you have a long chain of promises inside an organization, somebody needs to be accountable, and normally it's the end of the chain, because if I sit here waiting for you to give me something and I don't get it, and I wasn't smart enough to find other options, then I'm done. Okay. So I think in general, what we live now, it's this transition. We're transitioning into a world where we're going to have to reckon that something has to give. And accountability, it's a good way to ensure that without having to manage the others, right? Which is, by the way, and I think we are going to be long, but I think one interesting thing to say is this was the problem of industrialization. We have destroyed the world because we entitled people to tell others what to do. Now we don't have anymore I would say the need for this, because transactions costs are so low. So now it's really the moment to push accountability and push autonomy into small nodes and see what happens.
I mean, one last response, and then we'll get wrapped up because we are a little long. But it reminds me a lot of at Amazon, they have what they call the writing culture, and you have to write everything. And I think it's great. Like, you're supposed to write your ideas out before you go into meetings, so people can have access to your thoughts beforehand. You're not like performing on the fly type stuff. But one of the things that I understand is true about Amazon is that anybody can propose to do a thing at Amazon, but that one of the requirements is that they define a fitness function. This is your accountability. This is your KPI. I believe this to be true about the world. I believe this will solve for that thing that's true about the world. And this is how I will know whether or not it's being solved or not, as some sort, expressed as some sort of measurement or way of like determining that that's actually occurring. Right. So I think that, and the ideas from SRE around SLOs, and then finally, like a little bit of like, often I try to convince people a little bit of like, this I would kind of refer to what you're talking about as like boundary negotiation, like where the edges of things are and how they interact between things. I'm always trying to say what you should express to the downstream partner. In other words, the partner that you either sending information to or asking something from. You need to express the quality of your interaction, not the specificity of your interaction. So what I mean by that is like, I want this many transactions per minute on a data store, as opposed to saying, I need you to install Oracle so that I can run it, right? Like, these are two different conversations. And the unbundling ability of a platform, I think, is partially driven by how well do you do that abstraction. if you do the abstraction well, so that you're not having these leaky bindings across these different components, I think you get a lot more unbundability. But if you fail to negotiate the boundaries, you stick everything together into a big wad of mud. Anyway.
Yeah, interfaces and black boxes, basically.
Yep. Cool. So for everybody listening, 3 things that you think they should ponder about platforms as they listen to this or as they walk away from this conversation?
I wasn't prepared, sorry.
Good.
Probably this idea of this idea of accountability. It's one big talking point to bring home. Bifurcations, like, on one side, modular stuff, like the long tail graph, right? There's going to be 20% of the economy which is going to be editorial. The other 80% is going to be just things that you can squish together and get what you want with very, very easily. And lastly, I think another idea is, whenever you bundle something, think about that twice, because you basically accumulating risk.
Yep. Cool. And is there anything people can do to support your work or get in contact with you?
Well, yes. I mean, if you go to blss.io/newsletter or podcast or blog, you will find what we have. We write one piece every 2 weeks. We have a newsletter that gets out every 2 weeks and a podcast that gets out every 2 weeks. There is an episode with Jabe as well. So really, that's the entry point. Of course, we provide consulting services, and also, more importantly, free tools that you can, open tools that you can download, you can test. There are probably 400 pages of guides on our website, too much maybe, but again, this is a way to engage. Use our stuff, get to our trainings, or get in touch if you need help. We are always enthusiastic of doing work by researching with customers.
Excellent. I'll put links to that down in the description below. Simone, thank you. I really hope you'll come back and talk to us again. It was so much fun, very interesting as always. I learned a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Great work. I'm a listener already, so I'm going to follow the next episodes.
Excellent. Thank you, sir. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, man.